Today, I want to continue our study of the letter to James. Well, from James, rather. Well, one way or the other. Now, let's see if we can get into this text today. But first, I don't know whether you're a fan of drama or not. I really like really good drama. Lot you don't like, but I particularly enjoyed Peter Shaffer's play Amadeus. We saw it live, my son and I, Bobby, a number of years ago. And then they came out with the movie. And the movie, of course, is so much better than the play in many ways because of the color and the times, the costuming, and the music. Gorgeous, since I'm a kind of fan of the music of Mozart. But in the movie, there's a scene, I can't vouch for the accuracy of it, but it's kind of ought to be true if it isn't. The Emperor Franz Joseph prides himself on being a fan of the arts, or a patron of the arts, it would have been back then. And so he has a theater, and he has an orchestra, and he has a court composer who happens to be the somewhat notorious Antonio Salieri, who is extremely jealous of Mozart. But he's not the only one. The conductor of the opera and the choral conductor, they're intimidated by his genius. And so he puts, there's a performance of one of his operas, and it's really, today people recognize it as an incredible classic. But the emperor, he's really not very musical. He can't distinguish, he's like me, he can't distinguish the soul from a me. And, he wishes he could, and he gets bored, even at Mozart, bores him a little. So he kind of drops off a little, and this envious musician says, well, you know what, Emperor? Well, he didn't say it exactly that way, but he says, what's wrong is there's just simply too many notes in that composition. There's simply too many notes. So the emperor, foolish as he is, goes to Mozart and says, you've done a good job, but there's simply too many notes. But Majesty, there are only so many notes as are needed. What notes would you like to have taken out? It's like, you take away a single note, even Salieri said, and you ruin the whole thing. Take away a single note and you ruin the whole thing. Well, it's kind of that way with James. In a way, it's a really great composition. And there's some themes that are played in this composition that you don't hear stressed as much everywhere in the Bible. And so we're grateful to James for bringing these to us. So I always look forward to spending a little time with James, and I don't see him as an adversary in any way to Paul. But we'll get to that next week, Lord willing. So, remember, James is reacting against the mess that we humans make. And not only, I don't say environmentally, I don't know if that was that much of a problem then, maybe it was, but we weren't able to pollute on such a grand scale then, so we've acquired that ability over the years. But humans are a mess at times, and James kind of takes this on with the attitude people have toward one another, particularly in church, and he serves the church as a kind of a model of social justice, if you will. Now, don't get alarmed, because that's not a bad word. But I was thinking of my little mousy friend from one of the Narnia movies. Anybody remember the name of this little guy? Reepicheck, right? Okay, way to go. All right, you failed. And he said to me the other night as I was preparing this, stop messing up so much. Well, now, James and Reepicheck will be on the same page, basically. It's not the mice that, well, they do their own damage, but at least they don't throw plastic cups into the river. But it's beyond just environmental damage that we're doing. It's the damage we do to one another in relationships. And certainly, it ought to be in our fondest dreams that the church will be a place where people can find refuge, where they can find hope, where they can find encouragement, where they can find what they can't find anywhere else. That's the dream. It's a little bit like another musical that I really like, Camelot. I don't know whether you've seen that, or I've seen that a couple times. Got to see it with Richard Harris once. Fabulous. And as you know, as it closes out, the whole thing's coming to an end. It's all falling down. Lancelot has an affair with Guinevere, and that marriage has fallen apart. And now there's war between King Arthur and Lancelot. And he gets a little boy, Tom, I think his name is. I may be wrong about that. Some of you that are into it more than I will tell me if I'm wrong, I'm sure. And he sings this little song about Camelot. Once there was a spot named Camelot. And in the song was kind of this little phase of history. There was a place that believed in what was right and in justice and in the virtuous knights that would go around righting wrongs. They're about to go out of existence, but there was a Camelot, you see. Sometimes I think of Donelson that way. Not that we're phasing out or that Lancelot has been misbehaving, but that, you know, it is a gracious time for which we should be profoundly grateful. Now, James wants to keep that going, and so he says, now, one of the problems that we're having is this, that some of us are taking the faith of our glorious Lord Jesus Christ, and we're Christians, but we're showing partiality, we're showing prejudice in the way we treat one another. And for James, there isn't any more backward thinking. As I said last week, I make this into a scripture for you here. And he calls these people face receivers, which we translate showing preference, because face receiving doesn't mean a lot to us. But I think you can understand what that means. Like I look at Keith and I say he's a handsome man, and I receive him, and then I look at well, no, let's not go there. I look in the mirror, maybe that's better, put myself down, and I say, hey, you're not so good, you're not welcome here. So James is excited about that because he thinks there is no more backwards thinking than prejudice. There just isn't any more backward thinking than that. It's just thinking inside out. It's just totally wrong. And so he wants to get that stopped. But the people there don't think it's that big a deal. And so he wants to stress why this is important. Why, of all people, we cannot afford to be discriminating about the sort of people that we accept. So, James points out that in a way, this whole thing of riches and wealth is a kind of a relative idea. People can be wealthy monetarily, and somehow they think that confers upon them some privilege of status, some standing that should draw and attract immediate respect. And often it does. And because it does, people want that because they like that feeling of power and that feeling of being movers and shakers. That's important. And so it seems a little compensation to say that God has chosen the poor to be rich in the sphere of faith. And yet, when you think about it from a perspective of eternity, it begins to make a little more sense. And that idea has not really gotten across very well, so he's going to have to work on it a little bit. I don't think it's that James really despises rich people per se. I think what's disturbing him is the respect shown in churches toward the wealthy and the disrespect shown to the poor. And to him, a church can't do that. It can't do that. It's the one institution that cannot do that. Government can do it. Politics, it happens all the time, as we know. But in the world of faith, it should not happen. But it does. So how to deal with this? James says something along this line. He congratulates them in 2:8. If you love your neighbor as yourself, which he calls the royal law, you do well. Congratulations. However, there's more to this than you might think, because you may not be defining your neighbor exactly right. So, what do people need from those who make up God's kingdom? Well, not only loving their neighbor as their self, which I assume means you need a fairly good self-image, because the Bible has never said hate yourself, but the Bible has never said have a bad self-image. Because if you don't have a really good self-image, how are you going to love your neighbor as yourself? If you hate yourself, then you'll hate your neighbor, right? I mean, it makes sense, it seems to me. But you know, what do we need? What do we need? Well, now, if we don't have respect for people who are deprived, then that means there are a lot of people in this world who aren't going to have any hope. Now, Russ alluded to hope this morning, a very key idea in the Bible. The word hope, as he pointed out, that's what I believe for years and years and years, the Greek word hope, elpis, never means wishful thinking. It just never has that meaning. It has that meaning in English. I hope that girl will go out with me. Well, that's just wishful thinking. I've had students who said, I hope I get an A. Believe me, when I looked at the record, that wasn't even wishful thinking. It wasn't even close. And so you say, well, and of course, we all know that classroom and college work is not salvation by grace. It's work-oriented to the max, okay? Not occasionally the professor feels sorry for you, but don't count on that, okay? Hope. Boy, if our world needs anything, it's this, some hope. And not only that, and I was struck by this picture. It's a man who was evicted in Spain from his house, and this is all he has left. And for a companion, he has a little dog. And it touched me because that's kind of his only fellowship, you see. Dogs are good about that. Maybe we ought to bring some dogs in, or some, maybe not a cat or two. I don't know. I'm not much of a cat person. But here, if you feel lonely and we're not doing the job, here's Rover. You know, Rover is our fellowship dog. You think that'd be a good idea? You know, some people, it would probably make them happier than some of us, but maybe not. People do need this time. You know, community. Where is the community, you see? And James would say, somebody is being mistreated here. Somebody is being ignored here. Somebody is being alone. Those of you that know German understand the word in the upper right, of course. Allein. Alone. Alone. So James is going to look at siding with wealthy bullies and how that hurts the cause, okay? That's what he wants to talk about. Because they're not impressed with it being that big a deal. But if the problem of hopelessness and the problem of fellowship is to be somehow solved, we must recover a deeper identification with people than merely the way they are well off in the world or not. We have to get to that point. It's almost as if James is saying something like this. Why are you siding with these guys? They're really the bullies of the world. You need to be siding with the poor. You need to be putting your energy in trying to win the favor of the poor rather than the bullies of this world. And in that time, I suspect, and I could be wrong, of course, but the evidence seems to indicate there was a very strong, small class of exploitative, wealthy people who took advantage of the poor, made their living by depriving them and oppressing them. And so these guys are really, as a group, not much of a group to admire. And yet, James sees a church admiring this, admiring these kind of people, accepting these kind of people, and rejecting the other types. But James says of them, number one, they oppress you. Karadunastai, to oppress, is a very severe holding you down, stopping your opportunities, playing favorites, promoting their sons instead of people who are qualified. There's a story of a man who had a business, and he had a son. His son wasn't terribly gifted in many ways, except at spending money. At that, he was quite good. But the father thought he might help him if he went to work. So he got it one day, and he said, "You're going to learn the business." So he brought him over, and he put him with this fellow. We'll call him Joe. So the son says to Joe first day, "Dad says I should learn the business beginning at the bottom. Well, that didn't make Joe feel all that great, you know. But that man who was at the bottom knew so much more than Joe's son, but it didn't matter because he was oppressed, you see, by the structure of things. He says the rich also, that these bully rich, not just any rich person, but they're using the judicial system to rob the poor people. This is not uncommon in our world, as we well know. And he says that ought really to upset you, and you should be crying out against that, but here you are trying to make friends with these people. And worse than that, they speak evil of your Savior. So what you're doing actually is supporting people who oppress you and people like you. Now you may say, well, what does he want them to do? Rise up in rebellion? No, it's not like the French Revolution. He doesn't want that. That's never countenanced in the Bible. Violence doesn't solve the problem. But I think he would like them to understand what's happening when they're showing support for people who are trying to destroy them in a way. It's almost as like the Germans in a way, wonderful people, but Erich Fromm begins his book, Escape from Freedom, with these words. We are still yet to understand how 50 million Germans stuck their hands meekly out for Adolf Hitler to put the handcuffs on them. We still don't understand that, he says. The people of Beethoven, Goethe, Bach, how can this be? Something like this, I suspect. No consciousness of the oppression that should be recognized in society. It's almost as if he's saying, whose side are you on anyway? Whose side are you on? Well, there's not a one of us who would not rather be in some ornate dining room, feeding ourselves on Vichyssoise and Chateaubriand and maybe some pommes de terre, potatoes, than be where this poor boy is. Granted, I grant you that. And yet, it seems as if that's exactly where James feels would be a good place to be, as difficult as it may be to imagine. How do we end up supporting the oppressors? Whose side are we on? Now, if I were a member of this church, I would say back to James, how's that, James? Please, aren't you pressing this a little hard? What's really going on? He said, now take a look at what's happened. Now, you say this is just an imaginary incident. I think it's a real incident, and I want to tell you why. Because when you get down to verse 6, it says, you, plural, humes, dishonored the poor man, ton patokon, the single individual. You dishonored the poor man. This happened. And you don't even know you dishonored him. He said, what, his clothes were dirty. You dishonored him. Do you know where this is taking you? Now he says, how's that? Let me tell you. We like you and we don't like you. Okay, so it comes down to that. Now, when I get into that kind of shape, you might say, well, that's no big deal. It happens all the time. People play ins and outs. Even Jesus had favorites. It's true. But he never treated any of his other disciples with disrespect. He loved them all. And told them that over and over again. In the world that we live in today, it's probably impossible, although we try to have you ever gotten in this thing where somebody wants to be your friend on Facebook and they're just collecting friends? They don't care about you. You know? When you say, I have 5,000 friends, I'm trying to beat a record here, do you feel valued by this person? Mostly they'll use Facebook as an opportunity to put their photos of themselves in some favorable, well, that's humans for you. And as Repachick says, we got to do something about these humans. They're messing up the place. This is what's going on. And James does not see this, oh well, but he sees this as a very serious misunderstanding of the way the world's working. So I saw this sign. I thought it was cute. When something's going wrong, you know, Something's going wrong. Now we're starting to see these signs again on cars. Vote them all out. Well, that's going to really help, isn't it? We're going to get a whole crop of sagacious, enlightened statesmen. Yeah, okay. So that might give you satisfaction for a little while, but that's not what James is after. He's not trying to drive everybody out. He just wants to make them think a little bit about who they're relating to, that's all. Now, the rich sometimes are kind of proud of what they do. I love this sign and this just come right out and say it, you know. I mean, don't fool around. Oh, we're so glad to see you. Come in and have a seat. Or what is it in the Les Mis? Don't get me into that song again, but welcome, monsieur. Sit yourself down. Meet the best innkeeper in town. All of the rest, no. But is he the great innkeeper who's going to make sure? No. Remember the line in the song, but here we strive to lighten your purse. That's what these guys are doing. They're striving to lighten your purse. But why be so blatant about it? Well, if you're rich enough, who cares? You know, if you don't like it, punt. Or kick a field goal like poor Alabama tried to do. What a weird game. Now, has this been tried before? Now, I want to make this point that James, I think, is concerned about. When religion or spirituality goes bad and ties itself up with the power structures, no good can come. See, that's what he's really scared of. Suppose we line ourselves up politically with the powers that be to get our way and our understanding of how things ought to be in society. So now we use the political power and the power of wealth to change sides and make good things happen. Thomas Torquemada, the Grand Inquisitor. This guy really lived. He was a terror. In fact, according to historian, the Spanish historian, Joseph Perez, who is now the honorary director of the Veil of Christ Museum in Madrid and also an author, says, beginning with the papal bull, you know, bull doesn't mean like a male cow. In papal language, it's like a writing, you know, it's like a, Myra's laughing over here, you know, it's like a ukase in Russian, right? It's like a command in German. Okay, so he says, in 1478, now the first Spanish Inquisition started out as the royal power hooks up with the church to get rid of the undesirables. Okay. The first thing they're worried about is they see the Jews in the country have a lot of money, but a lot of the Jews have converted to Christianity, and someone says, suppose they really didn't convert. Suppose in their heart of hearts they're really Jews still. And somebody says, you know, I heard one talking about the Sabbath the other day. Ah, there you go. So if you could find two ignorant people, for whatever reason, who wanted to denounce somebody, you were doomed by the Inquisition. Now, this word Lutherans here, not really Lutherans, but later the Inquisition went on 350 years. Every Protestant was called a Lutheran in Spain, okay? So even a Church of Christ guy would be called a Lutheran in Spain in the Inquisition, okay? So it didn't have to be a Lutheran to be called one, okay? It was a bad name, get it? And you had a really great society going on now because you got religious power hooking itself up with royal power. And you say, well, why would they want to do this? Why would they hurt the country? 32,000 people burned at the stake over 350 years. A lot of people. Here's a letter written by someone who lived in Toledo in 1538. This is really sad. Living in that kind of society would be like living with Gestapo, wouldn't it? Notice what he says. This is hurting us. People have developed paranoia. There's a knock at the door. And it reminds me of the story of Dmitri Shostakovich in Russia, who wrote an opera that was very popular until a certain individual who really had very little musical appreciation went to see it. And the name of that person was Joseph Stalin. He was very offended by the opera because he thought it was bourgeois. And so he wrote an article in Pravda, Truth, Pravda, and it said, "Music or a muddle," severely attacking Shostakovich as not a true Soviet artist. For the next 17 years, Dmitri Shostakovich kept a backpack under the stairwell in his home in Russia because he thought the KGB or the MKV would be coming in the middle of the night to get him. And so he lived with that for 17 years, that fear. Religion there in the sense of communism, which was a religious movement without God. Now, then you say, well, why do they do this? It's goofy. Well, now we get to the bottom line, and Henry Kamen is a historian who's a revisionist in a way, and he questions some of the demonization of the Spanish Inquisition, but he comes right out and admits, and he got right down to the bottom line, it was about acquiring property. This is the best, because the Roman authorities in Rome, the Pope had decreed beginning from the 12th century onward that all heretics would have their property confiscated, and they made millions off of the Spanish Inquisition. Acquiring property. And now you say, well, you know, Bob, we would never do that in America. You know, we would never do that to anyone. We would never let power hook up with dishonoring a people. And I wish you were right. You ever heard of this? You ever heard of this? Anybody? Notice the Cherokee word for this. How does that come out in the way we talk about it? They call it what? The trail where they cried. We call it the trail of tears. This happened in America. It was about acquiring property. I wish I could be more generous, but it was about acquiring property. There was property white people wanted, and Indians lived on the land. We were the stronger, so there you go. So in 1830, the Indian Removal Act was passed in Congress and signed by President Jackson. And after this was signed, in about 1838 and 1839, in North Carolina and in Georgia, 15,000 Cherokees were rounded up, put into concentration camps. Their homes were plundered and burned and taken over by the local residents out in East Tennessee and in North Georgia. And then they were sent west in groups of about 1,000 on foot. You say, well, they deserve that because the Cherokees are just savages. They're just savages, that's all. May I contradict you? The Cherokees of all tribes had developed their own alphabet, a syllabary alphabet, but still an alphabet. It was created by this man named Sequoyah, for whom trees would later be named. They were publishing a newspaper called the Phoenix. They were very civilized people. But you see, they were living on land that people who with power and wealth wanted. And so there they go. In the middle of winter. And those who've studied this tell us this. In 1838 and 39, on the way to Oklahoma, a journey of some 12,000 miles, 4,000 Cherokees died. The combination of greed and wealth from a Christian people. Now, maybe you understand a little bit of why James is concerned about this axis, so to speak. And for James, it means being under the judgment of God to operate this way. Why share in the sin of the exploitative people? by trying to make them feel more important than the poor, you're saying what they're doing is okay. Instead of addressing the evils in society, you're becoming melded with the status quo. Judgment is not a very, very good thing because it means that God is going to right the wrongs that have been done. And the heavy hand of judgment. Now, if I'm one of these people, I'm saying, oh, James, really, you have overblown this thing. I mean, what a little prejudice, really. You're making a federal case out of this. Then he kind of comes back to them and says, hey, you know, you got a law out here, you got commandments. Here I'm thinking ethical laws, maybe Sermon on the Mount, Jesus, all the ethical laws of the Bible, Old, New Testament, whatever, that decry against injustice. You say, well, you know, at least we haven't committed adultery or we haven't killed anybody. We showed a little prejudice, big deal. And James tries to get them to understand that if you jump over the fence anywhere, it doesn't matter where, you're still out. You're on the other side. So, if you jump over the fence at dishonoring the poor and supporting the bullies, you're still out. That's the point. So what are you going to do? He said, well, fortunately or blessedly, I suppose, you need to say, mercy me. Because James ends up in verses 12 and 13 of chapter 2, thus speak and thus do as those who are to be judged by a law that gives you freedom. And that's the law in which you accept the mercy of God. For judgment is shown without mercy to those who show no mercy, but, in one of the greatest phrases of the Bible, mercy triumphs over judgment. What do you need to do? Find the ability to be merciful to people. That's the key. And so, take off your judge's hat. Take that judge hat off right now. And let mercy have its way. I hope we can see today the problem James is trying to struggle with here, and that what happens when power and religion hook up, you end up with some very, very, very dishonorable actions. And everybody says, what's the big deal? James tries to impress us. It is a big deal with God, okay? Well, God bless you, and try to go out there and eat your turkey soup or whatever remnants you have left.